Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon and warm welcome for this event dedicated to the lessons learned from COVID-19 pandemic recommendation for the future. Particular welcome to First Vice President Karas, to Mrs. Van Brempt, who was rapporteur of the Special Committee of Lessons Learned from COVID. Welcome also to the experts from the IMF and the panelists here. And of course, welcome to our online audience. It's a rainy day and some people have made this choice, and it's actually a good thing after COVID that EPRS has all event hybrid, so you can follow on site but also online. Just to say a few words on my side, we were at the beginning of 2020, like every year, discussing the 10 issues to watch, and it was the beginning of the pandemic, this strange thing happening in China. So it's not something that we saw coming, but at the time we had a session on children vulnerability and children poverty, and I think this is something that is at the crossroads of our discussions today. So, and fast forward 3.5 years, and the situation of our children has, if anything, become an even more pressing issue. The pandemic touches all. Its impact was very broad, affecting myriads of our everyday lives, putting untold pressure on our public healthcare system and shutting down our economies, damaging the very fabric of our local communities. Yet, its effects were felt most acutely by the most vulnerable in society, namely the children. That's the focus today. So we are very keen to have the experts from the IMF that are going to share with us their report and discuss today with us. I'd like also to mention the work of the Parliament in this very difficult time, and especially the work of the COVID Special Committee that was discussing the following areas: health, coordinating approach with respect for democracy and fundamental rights, societal economic impact, and the EU in the world, if you like, the international dimension. And since our colleagues are here also in the room, and you, Mrs. Van Brempt, just a couple of figures, because figures give also the scale of the work that has been put behind this exercise. There were not less than 3,281 amendments on this. That shows a very, very, very strong members' interest in this issue. 350 compromise amendments, and then the report went to plenary. We had also 30 hearings and workshops, gathering together 200 experts, and the resolution was adopted in July 2023. So, we are going to have this very exciting discussion today, and I'm going to invite Vice President Karas to give introductory remarks. Just like to say that something everyone knows, that Vice President Karas is in charge of the EPRS, but he has also several other duties in the Bureau. And it was a very special time for the Parliament, because you remember under President Sassoli, you in the Bureau and the leadership of the House make sure that European democracy doesn't stop in these very difficult times. I was not given, that was not so easy, but it has been managed. So we are very happy to have you with us today, First Vice President, and to listen to you. Thank you very much.
Dear honourable members of the European Parliament, dear Kathleen van Brempt, dear members and dear panelists and experts, dear representatives of the EPRS and the IMF, ladies and gentlemen, online and in presence. Thank you very much, Etienne, for your opening remarks, and not only for your opening remarks, also for the work of your work and the work of your team in the EPRS to organize all these meetings and to support all members of the European Parliament and their assistants to do the daily work in an efficient and base-oriented way. And I am really delighted to open yet another event organized by the European Parliamentary Research Service and the International Monetary Fund. The International Monetary Fund is a very important partner for the EPRS and for the European Parliament, and we are working not only on the academic side, we are also working in research. We are also working very closely on the political issues and with personal cooperations on the different levels. We have developed excellent relations between those two institutions. That is important because your forecasts, analyses, and global overviews are a crucial source for our work as European Parliament. Like many national parliaments, the European Parliament established a special committee on the COVID-19 pandemic to monitor the impact of the pandemic and to put forward recommendations for the future. In today's panel discussion, we will be debating the European Parliament's resolution based on the work of this COVI special committee. We will hear the views of the special committee and the views of the discussed report. The panelists will look in more detail at what we can learn from the pandemic and how we can prepare for the future. As the topic is very broad, we will be zooming in to investigate the very heart of this issue by turning our attention to how this health crisis affected some of the most vulnerable members of our society, our children. And we must state, COVID-19 pandemic brought enormous disruption to children worldwide. Up to 1.6 billion children worldwide were affected by school closures, and a whole generation of children and young people are still suffering from the consequences. And in this case, not only in this case, the pandemic is not over. It's continuing. It's part of our daily life. Perhaps most worryingly of all, it is children and young people from the most disadvantaged backgrounds who have suffered the most. Child poverty is associated with lower educational achievement and poorer physical and mental health. And this affects a child life perspective as the long-term effects of child poverty often persists into adulthood. It is only by putting children at the heart of the debate that we can have any hope of developing effective policies that can make a real difference to their lives and our common future. And that is why Parliament fully supports the move to lower the voting age for young people to 16. Also and especially in the elections to the European Parliament. Currently, there are just 4 member states where children can vote at age 16. And I am pleased to say that my own home country, Austria, is one of them and was one of the first. Let me end with a quote from Indira Gandhi. The true measures of any society can be found in how it treats its most vulnerable members. Children are the most vulnerable members, and they are our future. It is therefore high time that we give those members, our children and young people, a real voice in the debate. Thank you, and I look forward to a very interesting discussion today And again, thank you to our panelists to be with us this morning and to discuss with us our common future, our children. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Vice President Karas, for those very valuable remarks. I think you've really helped to set the scene for the discussion today and drawn attention to some of the main issues at stake. As you say, the issue of drawing lessons and recommendations from the pandemic is a very broad one. So our focus today on children will be the lessons will be all the more valuable, as I think, as you say, as this concerns a particularly hard-hit group within society, children. My name is Chris van der Up. I work for the European Parliamentary Research Service, and I'm delighted to say I'll be your moderator for today's event. So I'll give you a quick overview of proceedings today, the running order. We'll begin shortly with a presentation from our two distinguished speakers from the IMF, Jean-Jacques Hallaert and Iglika Vassileva. This will be followed, their presentation, by a short overview from my colleague from the EPRS, Susanna Tenhunen, who will give you a presentation on the main points of the EP's resolution from the COVID Special Committee, in particular with respect to children and young people. Thereafter, we will begin with a roundtable discussion involving, on my left, MEP van Brempt, Kathleen van Brempt, who is the chair of the former Special Committee on COVID and who had an integral role in the work of this committee. And also joining in the discussion will be Margherita Leone from Save the Children, who will bring her organization's own unique perspective to the table, which we're very much looking forward to today. I think it's safe to say that whatever our background and wherever we come from, the experiences of COVID will linger on in our collective memory for many years to come. And the issues we'll be discussing today, I think, are close to the hearts of many of us here. So without further ado, I'm delighted to hand you over to our two speakers from the IMF. Welcome, bienvenue, dobre došli. The floor is yours. And thank you both for traveling so far to be with us here today from Washington and from Bulgaria. Thank you.
Good afternoon to everybody here and online, and thank you for the nice words from the three of you. We are very honored to be here to present our work, which is available online and on the IMF website. And we are looking forward to the discussion to learn from your own experience, and we can share what your analysis is. We have a very short time to make the presentation, and so it will be very dense, and as a result I think it would be useful to present the message of our paper up front. The first one, the starting point, is that the child poverty has increased dramatically in the EU during the pandemic. That we all know. What is sometimes overlooked is that this can be a scarring channel from the pandemic lingering, as the Vice President told us, for a long time. It could be a scarring channel because not only it reduces life prospect and well-being of affected children, which is a tragedy in itself, but it also has a long-term economic impact. And to mitigate this scarring effect, we argue that both the labor and the fiscal policies have a role to play. And their role should be twofold. We should target two objectives. they should try to reduce as quickly as possible the level of child poverty in Europe, but they should also try to mitigate the long-term impact of child poverty because some of the damage is already done. Now, a familiar word, you will not be surprised from somebody at the IMF. We are at a time of post-COVID and policymakers in many European countries face a difficult trade-off and face the necessity of fiscal consolidation for various reasons. And in that case, our message is to remind people that when designing the fiscal consolidation, please keep in mind that family and children allowances has a very high social return, and it's a relatively small spending overall. So let's go into the detail now. The facts first. You have the chart here, and you see that in 2020 alone, the child poverty of children that we measure by severe material deprivation increased by 19% in Europe. It's almost 1 million additional children suffering from poverty. That's the blue line on the chart. And you see that the increase of poverty of children is larger than the increase of poverty of the working age population, while the poverty of the elderly has continued to decline during the first year of the pandemic. We don't have the data beyond 2020 for severe material deprivation, but we have for other indicators, and we suggest for the indicators that go to 2022 that it was not reversed. At best, it's flat at the level of 2020. At worst, it increased a little bit. We will have to wait a little bit for data, but there's no ground to believe that it was a one-off spike. We are at least 3 years of increase in child poverty compared to 2019. This increase is large, but not every country in the EU faced an increase in child poverty. Some countries saw a massive increase. It was large in Germany, it was large in Spain, it was large in Romania, but child poverty declined in other countries, as you can see on the table on the bottom of the slide, in countries like Denmark or Estonia, trying to be diverse here on the country. So, the second part of the argument is to say, well, beyond the dramatic impact and tragic impact it has on the life of the children, it could have long-term effect. What we call a scarring effect. I put you there the IMF definition of scarring. Bear with me, it's a bit technical, but I promise it's the only sentence that will be a bit difficult. It is the scarring effect defined as a diminished long-term output relative to pre-pandemic projection may occur due to pandemic-induced damage to capital, labor, and productivity. In plain English, the potential growth or the growth in the future may be diminished because of the impact of the pandemic, because of its impact on capital, labor, and productivity. And our argument is that child poverty, left unaddressed, would reduce the growth of Europe because of its impact mostly on productivity. So let's develop a little bit on this. As we know, child poverty is dramatic for children. It affects their well-being, but it also affects their development, their skills acquisition, their health, their educational achievement, you mentioned that. All of this is capital, human capital that will make productivity lower if we don't try to solve the problem that children experienced. In the paper, we will see a lot of review of literature, but I would like to highlight 3 things that are important when we design the policy to address child poverty. The first one is that child poverty has more damaging impact on younger children. The younger the child is affected by poverty, the longer the impact of child poverty will be on him, because, for example, child poverty affects structurally the brain development and the language acquisition of younger children. Of course, at 15, this is not anymore the case. The second element is the impact, the negative impact of poverty increases with the duration in poverty. That should not be a surprise, but that is important for the policy design. And as you mentioned also, this will linger throughout the life of an individual. And actually, literature shows that it's passed to the next generation. Health damage during childhood due to poverty or education are significantly passed to the children of the children who suffered from poverty. So we got a very long impact. The economic impact, as I mentioned, is a reduced productivity because lower capital human acquisition, but it's also something that we have to bear in mind. If unaddressed, child poverty will have a lot of impact on fiscal of the country. Mitigating child poverty in 20 years may be a major cost for the budget of the countries. There are not many studies, but the study that exists mostly in the US put the cost of child poverty around 4 to 5% of GDP. The numbers doesn't matter, it's just large. And they say 1/3 is productivity, 2/3 is long-term fiscal cost. We have to bear that in mind also for the consequences and the design of policies. A last point, child poverty tends to increase during all crises. But the COVID crisis may have a more scarring impact than usual crises. There are several reasons for that, but just let me emphasize 2 of them. As we know, unusually during the COVID, there was lockdown. Schools and nursery were shut down. We all know that children, it's well documented in every country, children have lost of education during this time. And this loss of education is more severe for the poorer children. Now, the question is, how do we recoup this loss? Will the poorer children recoup as fast and as much as the more or the wealthier children, if you want to? And on this, we don't have firm evidence, but the preliminary evidence is not really encouraging. So we create a lingering inequality potentially. It's also an unusual loss of a nurturing environment for children who are from a poor family. Studies show that early education for poor children is very important, notably in language acquisition because of the caregiver at school and the interaction with peers. The second element is the stress and anxiety. Mental health issues increased dramatically in COVID, not just for children, but for parents. And it's a well-established fact in the medical and pediatric literature that the stress of parents not only affects the quality of their parenting, but also affect the cognitive skills of children. And again, for the younger, the brain development in a structural and permanent manner. So potentially, the rise of poverty during COVID would be more damaging and having a more scarring effect than in previous crises. So we got the policy implication from this. Policy should have the 2 objectives I mentioned initially. Reduce rapidly the level of child poverty. Remember, the longer a child is in poverty, the more damage there is. And mitigate the long-term impact of this poverty because of the lingering effect on children. An important point, it's much less costly to reduce poverty now than to mitigate its impact in 20 years. It's a very high social return investment. Finally, the effort should be broad-based. Child poverty is multidimensional. Synergies are large between policies. And if we want to solve effectively child poverty and reduce its impact, it's not just increasing the income of parents and reducing the monetary poverty of children. So which policy do we have? We made a small econometric investigation, and I let Iglika, who is better placed than me, to discuss this.
Thank you. Just a small aside on the econometric investigations that we did. Jean-Jacques asked the question, which policies matter, and to identify the appropriate policies, we tried to look into the drivers of child poverty. So basically we took the IMF approach. What we did is just to look at macro data. Typically such studies are based on micro data, on individual data, but it was not readily available to us. And then we wanted to look also at cross-country comparisons and also to gain a little bit more of variation. So we used macro data. We performed panel regressions and also a couple of other methods using severe material deprivation as our main variable. And we identified three large groups of factors that contribute to child poverty at macro level. These are structural determinants such as the household characteristics, the labor market structure, the inequality in the economy. Also, we have another group of factors, which is the cyclical factors, which we used unemployment, and also in other specifications we used output gap as a variable to measure the cyclical position of the economies. And of course, we have policy determinants. In our investigation, we found that social benefits, especially spending on family and children, has a large and very important impact for reducing child poverty. Briefly, just to say that other than these specifications that we show on this slide right now, we've done a couple of different specifications in terms of using a different measure of child poverty, such as the at-risk of poverty indicators, anchored at risk of poverty indicators. And we also played around with the explanatory variables. So I think that we managed to show, you can see it in the paper, that our results and our identified determinants are quite robust. And just a final word to say that we also tried to investigate some nonlinear relationships in our data. So we did some machine learning methods in order to see whether there are some less evident relationships between the variables, and we did, I think, 5 or 6 machine learning methods, and they all show that that we can kind of identify broadly the same factors, namely from the structural, it would be the low, the share of children living in households with low work intensity. From the cyclical, it seems that unemployment is a very important variable, and when it comes to policy determinants, it's very important to note that the family and children spending has a significant contribution for lowering child poverty. That's, if you have further questions, I would be happy to answer them after the presentation.
Thank you, Iglika. So we got the result there, and the result suggests that labor policy and labor variables have an important role to play. One of them is the low work intensity of parents. We got the numbers, it's extremely significant, but I put a chart to be more visible up front, and you got the chart on the top of this slide, which shows in bar the poverty of children, and you see how much it's associated with unemployment and low work intensity. So the first thing is, if we want to adjust, act on the level of poverty, we may want to increase the work intensity of parents, and how we do that in terms of policies. The first one, it will not be a surprise here, you're all familiar probably with the Barcelona objective, but it's to facilitate the access to childcare. And indeed, when you look at the survey in Europe, when people tell you why they don't use more childcare, they mention the financial cost. And the policy work on the financial cost. You can see on the bottom chart how much the cost is reduced for parents. That's the total bar shows the total cost, and the blue bar is the cost paid by parents. So it's much reduced, and it's much lower in 2021 than it was in 2015. So the policy have reduced a lot the cost and thus facilitate the access to childcare. It succeeded in its objective to foster women labor force participation. Well, there was a setback, of course, during the crisis, the pandemic, but the latest data show it rebounded quite strongly after that in 21 and 22, at least for the younger children. But the impact on child poverty has been relatively muted. And the reality is we facilitate the access of childcare, but it was not the poorest parents, most of the time the poorest mother, who could access it. It was the richer one. So the impact has been relatively muted. The second one is if you want people to work more to reduce poverty of children, it's to get a higher income. The problem is in many countries of Europe, if a single parent, which Iglika showed you is very strongly associated with child poverty, works more, and you got the chart there just for a single parent decided or taking the opportunity to increase his work, if he or her increase her work from 33% of the full-time to 2/3, how much does the increase the income of the household? Well, if you look at the blue bar, you will see that in countries like Belgium and Spain, there's no net increase. In countries like Croatia, there's a decline in the net income if you work more, just because there are more taxes and loss of benefits. But the good side, if you look at the chart, you see in countries like Slovakia or Ireland that it's possible to have a social system, a tax and benefit system that increase more than just the labor income of the parents who decide to work more. The last thing we can do to facilitate the work of parents of poor children is to facilitate their capacity to work, facilitate their ability to combine work and potential duties. That's a lot of structural reforms. For example, if you provide leaves for sick children, that will help people to work and not stop working because the child is sick. It's very important for some parents, and again, especially for single parents. Turning to another dimension of the labor policies. If you want to increase the income of poor households, you may want to increase their take-home wage. We can think of different methods. The immediate option would be to increase when there was one and the minimum wage, but that may reduce the opportunity of work for some parents. The other one is the policies that have been developed in countries like France, where you reduce the social contribution of employers on the low end of the wage scale. It shows that it increased dramatically the creation of low-skilled jobs without reducing the income. Another option is we can think of the tax credit like the US on income tax. And there is strong evidence there that increased labor supply, notably of single parents, reduced poverty, and it's all linked to improvement in the health and education of children. So it's not just the impact on the revenue. Finally, a very important factor. Iglika showed you in the table that temporary jobs are associated with the level of child poverty. The instability of work, when it's not chosen, has dramatic impact. Providing a stable income would thus reduce the level of poverty, but it will also mitigate the long-term impact. And there are several reasons. Again, parents who have a single income, stable income, tend to have less stress, and we have already saw the impact of stress and mental health, well-being on child poverty and its consequences. The literature shows also that children attend school longer when the parents have a stable income. And finally, something that was very important during the COVID, if you got a stable income, you tend to have a better social protection in time of crisis, protecting better the children. And finally, something that will not surprise you, improving the skills of the parent and their capacity to work will also help. And you can see on the chart that the lower the education attainment of parents, the higher the chance for a child to be poor. So labor policy will help, but as I said, it involves a lot of reforms, and reforms take time. It is worth doing, but we have to be very mindful of the time dimension of labor policies. Fiscal policies, on the contrary, have a powerful effect. We have seen that in the econometric work, and they work dramatically. And you see the current situation is here on the chart, the income poverty, and you see that the reduction of income poverty is pretty large for children, thanks to the fiscal transfers. Now, as I said, we are in a difficult situation post-COVID, where we have to make some fiscal consolidation. So we were trying to find the lessons that we had in a similar period, which was post-global financial crisis. What happened during the post-financial crisis? Child and family benefit were cut quite strongly. You have it on the two charts. On the top chart is the cut in spending by states at the EU level on children and family. The cut was quite significant, while the spending on pensions continue as business as usual. When you take a broader view, you got the chart at the bottom, you see the cut in real terms per inhabitant of children and benefits. Some of them were very large, while other social spending were cut less, or even in some countries, family and children benefits were cut, and all over spending together increased. So 10 years ago, roughly, the choice was to reduce spending on children to facilitate the fiscal consolidation. It was not the only thing that happened. When you have to make some fiscal consolidation, the temptation is large to do some targeting. I will achieve the same result spending less by better targeting. And theoretically, that works. In practice, it's difficult to implement. But we see in Europe, child and family allowances were increasingly means tested, and they were also increasingly provided in kind. And this increase in kind is due to the effort put on childcare. What lessons do we have? The first one, as was pretty obvious from what I just said, is post-crisis, at least maintain the family and children. It's a very small spending, and cutting it will not bring you something, but you're cutting a spending with very high return. We have developed a little bit the regression that Iglika showed you, breaking down the family and children variable into 4, combining means tested and in-kind testing. What do we find? Is that there's an increase of the efficiency of spending on poverty of the younger. If we increase the in-kind, that's normal, they benefit from the childcare, but not on the older children. And surprisingly, non-means testing spending have a larger impact on the level of child poverty than the means tested spending. That may be due to various reasons, including default in the design of the scheme. Finally, my last slide, Chris. I see, I'm spending too much time.
I was going to intervene, but if you're brief.
No, very quickly then. Remember again, reducing the level of child poverty is important, but it should not make us forget that we need to implement policy to mitigate the long-term impact, and that requires a lot of public investment. Investment in education, as policies have reduced the cost of childcare, then comes the next binding constraint, which is the availability of the infrastructure. So if you want to continue to facilitate access to childcare, there may be some need to invest in childcare. It's not just the physical infrastructure, it's also the personal to have a high quality childcare. The schools, we have already talked about the impact of the COVID. Investment in health and nutrition is very important. And of course, on the social housing. I will stop there and go very large, but bottom line of this, these policies are all an impact, but the synergies are very large, so we should think into a package. Thank you, and sorry for being too long.
Thank you very much, Jean-Jacques, for that excellent presentation. I think it's all too easy to forget the huge impact that the pandemic has had on children and young people now that we're a couple of years down the line. And it's particularly sobering to see that the pandemic clearly had an impact on the most disadvantaged children who suffered the most, who suffered the heaviest toll. I think you've certainly given us lots of food for thought with particularly when it comes to the labour policies and the fiscal policies, and I hope we'll be able to dig into those two ideas a little bit further on in our panel discussion, which brings me neatly on to the next stage of today's programme. We'll turn to our panel of experts for a discussion on the lessons we can draw from the pandemic and the recommendations for the future, with a particular focus on children. So proceedings will be organised as follows. We'll have 2 rounds of questions. The first will be looking at the lessons that we can draw from the pandemic with respect to children. I'll ask each panellist here to identify the single most lesson they consider to be the most important with respect to children. Secondly, I'll ask each panellist to highlight what they consider to be the most important recommendation going forward with regards to children. Speakers will be at liberty to draw on the findings of the wonderful IMF report we've just heard about, the Parliament's COVID-19 resolution, or indeed based on their own experience and expertise in their field. And so to help prepare the ground further for this discussion, I think it would be useful to take a closer look at the EP's COVID-19 resolution from July this year. In principle, it's a broad, all-encompassing document which was very comprehensive and consisting of over 100 pages in the final cut. It consists of 4 main pillars: health, a coordinated approach to democracy and fundamental rights, the social and economic impacts of the pandemic, and lastly, EU and the world. The issues we'll be referring to today are covered mainly in the 3rd pillar on the social and economic impact of the pandemic. And we will now hear from my EPRS colleague, Susanna Tenhunen, who will talk about the lessons learned and the future action put forward by Parliament, focusing in particular on children and how the pandemic impacted them. Susanna was very closely involved in the preparation of 2 studies prepared together with external experts that helped feed into the work of the COVID Special Committee. Her expertise primarily focused on the health and the democracy and fundamental rights pillars of the resolution and COVI report, but she also covered social issues as well to a smaller extent. And so, without further ado, it gives me great pleasure to give you the floor, Susanna.
Thank you, Chris. It is a great pleasure for me to kickstart this panel discussion and to briefly introduce the Parliament's COVID-19 resolution, what it has to say about children and youth, and what kind of action it promotes. Parliament in this resolution takes a very broad look to the negative impact of COVID-19 to children and young people in general, And then it pays special attention to those coming from more vulnerable backgrounds, because they suffer disproportionately from the social, health and economic distress caused by the pandemic. Parliament calls for action notably on 4 broad areas: mental health, education, funding, and making the voice of youth and young people, children and young people, better heard in decision making. Education and mental health are areas that belong to the competencies of member states, but there is broad support for coordination of actions at EU level, and also EU level common targets on this area. To start with our first item, mental health. It is a sad yet well-documented legacy of the pandemic that mental health situation aggravated. And according to OECD figures, in several member states, among children and young people, symptoms of depression even doubled. Yes, even doubled. What then the Parliament resolution says about mental health? It takes note of this development, and it supports strongly cross-sectoral policies and investments in member states to recognize mental health disorders and to ensure access to services. It also encourages member states to take mental health as part of their emergency and preparedness planning. And it reiterates a long-term call for a comprehensive mental health approach at European level. And Parliament also calls to make mental health a priority in the European Health Union. And then coming to our second topic, which was education. The lockdowns and distance learning is probably one of the most memorable common experiences we have from the time of the pandemic. This, was presented in the IMF report, led to many positive things, but also significant learning losses, and especially the gap between students coming from lower socioeconomical backgrounds compared to those coming from economically resilient households. This learning gap widened during the pandemic. And in this context, Parliament encourages measures of complementary education for those in need. It also underlines how important it is to bring forward digitalization of education and schooling in general, and also the importance of access to tools for everybody, regardless of their socioeconomic background. Parliament also encourages to take digital literacy as part of the curricula of teachers and other educators. This is very much in line with the implementation of the European Child Guarantee and the European Education Area, the framework up until 2030. Now we have taken a look to mental health and education. Let's turn to the third topic, funding. And there I want to mention very briefly 2 things. As the implementation of the RRF, the Recovery and Resilience Facility, is in full swing right now, Parliament underlines this opportunity for member states to take advantage of the loans and grants available to support children, young families, young people. And it also asks for the EU and the member states to closely monitor the implementation of the RRF in these fields. Also, there is a call for compensatory measures especially to mitigate the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on children in danger of social exclusion or poverty, and young people coming from socioeconomically disadvantaged backgrounds. And then now this leads me to the fourth and the last topic, which is to make better heard the voice of children and young people in decision making. There, lawmakers asked for a systematic gathering of information on how COVID-19 pandemic affected children and young people in order to have solid evidence base for policy debate and decision making, and to understand the special needs of these groups, both in time of normal circumstances as well as in time of emergencies. And on this positive note on how to make the voice of children and young people better heard in decision making, I give the floor back to Chris.
Thank you very much, Susanna, for your excellent overview of the main points of the EP's resolution. I think you've very well managed to identify 4 key areas that I hope will feed into our discussion in a little while. So, if I remember correctly, mental health, education, funding, and giving children a greater voice. So I would now like to ask the panel members to share their thoughts and reflections on today's main topic of discussion. So first, having heard our speakers today and based on your own work, we'll be looking at the first theme, which will be, what do you consider to be the most important lesson that we can draw from the pandemic when it comes to our children? And if I may, I'd like to start with the lady sitting to my left here, Kathleen van Brempt. As the chair of the former special COVI committee, you perhaps have the broadest view of anyone when it comes to the whole different range of lessons that we can draw from the pandemic. But if you had to choose, if I had to force you into a tight corner and to focus just on one single lesson, what would that be?
Then you can, yeah, okay, thank you. Then you can stop me or interfere. You know, politicians, they can talk for hours. Huh? That's an impossible question for sure, but let me try to take that holistic approach, and because it also applies to the subject of today, youngsters and children. It's even broader than the pandemic. It's something that we all know, but we tend to forget when it comes to taking measures and policies. That is a crisis. A crisis has, sadly enough, always the effect that it touches upon, and it's more or less, touches upon always the most vulnerable. And so it always aggravates injustice and social, social injustice. And if you look to the pandemic, it happened as well. And we had, because the pandemic, of course, is in the first instance, not overall, but in the first instance, a health crisis. And so what happened in the pandemic is that in every of our member states, and also at the European level, and also in the rest of the world, specialists, mainly on health, advised governments to get out as soon as possible of the pandemic and to safeguard people that were most vulnerable when it comes to the health impacts. And in terms of generations, you then see the full focus on people that are vulnerable in health, mainly elderly people, but also people with all sorts of medical issues, underlying problems, and that was the focus. And for that we, for instance, closed the schools more than once. And we've seen in the IMF study, but we also have studies that we consulted, and a lot of experts coming to our COVI committee explaining what happened over there. And that's why you will see the effect on health, mental health, mental health, and on school results. And that has an immediate impact on the increase of poverty and child poverty. And so if you ask me the next time, we should, before we start dealing with the crisis, whether it's a pandemic or it is a war or it is a financial crisis, take that slogan that any crisis always has the hugest impact on the most vulnerable, and so it increases social injustice. And that should be then the way to look at it. So if you ask me, and again, when it was all happening, we were just looking, and people had to take decisions, but it is in the report. It's softly written because it's not our competence. You always have to be careful. We do not decide whether or not to close schools. It's softly written, but it is in the recommendations. We should not close schools again.
Thank you very much for getting the ball rolling there with that interesting. And indeed, I understand you're quite right. Impossible, perhaps, question to answer fully. Indeed, I remember reading that in the report as well, the issue of closing schools, and if I'm not mistaken, it's somewhere there in the EP's report to avoid doing that in the future if at all possible. So I'll turn now to Margherita Leone as someone who's on the other side of the policy fence and working in an organization that focuses specifically or exclusively on improving the lives of children worldwide. You probably have a rather different perspective on this issue, and I'm sure you've also have many, many ideas. But again, if you could just focus on one lesson that we can draw from the pandemic, what would it be?
For this, and just let me say something, because before looking into the lesson learned, we have spoken so far, of course, of children in Europe and how much child poverty has impacted children in Europe. But from a global perspective, let's not forget that in 2020, 147 more million children were pushed into poverty because of the crisis, because of the pandemic, and because of the socioeconomic fallout that the crisis had at that moment and is continuing to have. And of course, this is a crisis of poverty. This is a crisis when we look forward also about, capital, skills, investment, economy. This is also a crisis of child survival. Child survival in the past few years have actually got very much worse. Children are struggling to reach 5 years old. The children didn't get immunized because of the COVID pandemic, because not of the COVID pandemic, but because the pandemic just show how much health systems were unfortunately not that strong as we expected to be. To come back to Europe and looking at my lesson learned, actually it doesn't differ very much from what I'm hearing here today, and thanks a lot, actually. What it is important for me is that in the next crisis, in any crisis, in all the multiple crises that we are currently living, because COVID is not over, we have climate change, we have conflict that are increasing, we are not living through the easiest historic moment, if we can say so. We cannot allow ourselves to leave children behind, never. Never, 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 not because of the return of investment, not because of the capital that we will be building, not because of the educational and the working skills, but because their fundamental rights are at risk right now in Europe and all around the world. And they will continue to be, of course. So that is my point.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for those extremely interesting comments. Lastly, Jean-Jacques and Iglika, your report has shown in very real terms the huge impact that the pandemic has had on children's lives and on increasing child poverty exponentially. So the same question to you when it comes to a single lesson that you could draw from these figures and from this research, what would it be?
Yeah, basically I will summarize what Jean-Jacques just said, and given that what the previous panelists said, we cannot leave the children behind, so we have to take action. And the action has to be both in terms of reducing child poverty, but also in terms of mitigating the long-term impact of the damage that has already been done. Currently, the governments across the globe, not only in Europe, they're facing consolidation needs, fiscal consolidation needs, and in these circumstances, it is important to maintain the level of child spending, or of course, if possible, to increase it, because of two main reasons. One reason is that it is much less costly to reduce child poverty than to mitigate the long-term impact, the scarring effect of the child poverty. And the other reason is that child spending has a high social return. So that would be our main conclusion and lesson learned.
Very good, thank you. So it's really talking about mitigating the long-term impact that you referred to in your report. Very good. You'd like to take the floor, Susanna, briefly?
It's just to very briefly mention again the issue on mental health that came forward strongly in the Parliament COVID resolution. And this summer, the Commission then published the comprehensive approach to European mental health, or European comprehensive approach on mental health. And meanwhile, the Parliament's subcommittee on public health, the SANT subcommittee, is working on an own initiative report on mental health. So that just to highlight that actions has been taken also after the resolution was voted this July. Actually, the Commission communication came out a bit earlier, but Parliament has been very active, not only in this resolution, but also in others on mental health. Thank you.
I think we can take the credit for the Commission's work in this area. I think we're always happy to do that here at the European Parliament. Thank you for your contributions, having considered now the lessons that we can draw from the pandemic in relation to our children. We'll turn to the second area of focus today by looking at your future recommendations in this field. But before we go to that, I'd like to just here in the room have a quick fire survey. If you think about what's happening in your own country, and please raise your hands, do you feel the authorities in your own country are doing enough to support children and young people to help them recover from the pandemic? Just quickly. Okay, I think that's a pretty damning indictment of what's going on across Europe in our different countries. I can't see too many hands raised there, indeed two in a room of 30 odd people. So I think we can agree that there's a general feeling that member states do indeed need to do much more to improve the situation of children and young people. And so with that in mind, what concrete recommendations do our panelists have for our audience today? Perhaps this time I'll start with you, Margherita Leone. As we heard, the COVI resolution did indeed contain several key recommendations in the area of mental health. But based on your work, what would you consider to be the most important recommendation going forward?
Well, thanks a lot for this. I think that, we have spoken, first I did, about the multiple crises and the situation that is not very comforting at the moment. But I think that on the other hand, we really need to look on all the efforts that the EU, both the Commission and the Parliament, have been doing in the past couple of years when it comes to fighting child poverty and to support the children of all over Europe. There is right now an incredible momentum at European level in looking into children. There has been the launch of the child guarantee, the launch of the national action plans for the implementation of the guarantee, the European target on reducing child poverty. And if we look also from a global health perspective, the Commission has been leading on the Team Europe approach when it was during the pandemic. It's continuing to playing an absolutely leading role on the negotiations on the pandemic accord, have just launched the new EU Global Health Strategy, which looks at universal health coverage and primary health care as pillars to ensure that all, including children, have access to health. What we need to do now, it's really to build on this momentum. There is the political will. We welcome the political will. Now translate all the words into actions. And while we translate all the words into actions, first of all, let's try the way to support member states. Social protection is not among the mandates of the European Union, but both the Parliament and the Commission have a strong role in fostering a conversation, exchanges of best practices, challenges, finding solutions, providing support, not only financial support, but also, networking support. One of the mistakes that we did maybe when COVID hit was to have a little bit of a too much fragmented answer to what happened. I think that this is the role of this Parliament and of the Commission to continue to work on this. Let's invest on the instrument. The Commission has just launched the Child Participation Platform. So when it comes about listen to children, the EU is actually championing the participation of children into the EU policymaker. So let's move on. And I think actually, if you allow me 10 seconds more, that the EU elections next year will be a great opportunity, both for the European Commission, but especially for the European Parliament, because we can really call MEPs to be child rights advocates in the next legislature and ensure that all EU policies do no harm to children, listen to children, and prioritize children's rights in the policymaking.
Very much. A strong call for action there, I think, on behalf of your organization, and I can see a definite will there. You're saying there's a political will to turn words into action, and as I'm sitting next to a politician here on my left, how would you see that process panning out?
Well, it's too much to do that within the time frame we still have left, because as also been mentioned in your report, and you can see that if you read about poverty and child poverty in particular, it's a very multidimensional problem. So it's not, you cannot pick it and say this is what we're going to do. But let me first take the European perspective and then say something about what I think should happen in the member states related to that. Again, the issues, most of the issues related to child poverty are not European competences, but we do have, we have the coordination, we can do best practices, all these soft things important. But the most important thing that we have, that is the oversight on the budgets of the member states. And another crisis before the pandemic was the financial crisis. And it's been mentioned. The financial crisis, in the pandemic, you could say, okay, the focus was wrong just to look at health, and we did not take into account what happened to children in the pandemic. Yeah? But in the financial crisis and the aftermath of the financial crisis, we deliberately, and I say we, I was not part of it in the sense that I'm a member of parliament and I absolutely argued and activated a lot against it. But the Commission took the lead at that time to take that oversight competence on the budgets to force member states to cut social expenditure, mainly in the south where we had the issue on Greece. But overall, one of the countries that said no, it was Belgium. And you can see that in the figures. We didn't cut on social expenditure. So that is the first thing that you need to do. If we talk about, we're in the middle of the Green Deal discussions, and we talk about investment in renewable energy, we use the word investment. When we talk about education, we talk about expenditure. It's completely wrong. And that's what also is very important in the report. It's much more cheaper to invest now in tackling child poverty than to mitigate afterwards. But still, and you're economist, I guess, but still a lot of economists do not get that. And neither does the European Commission, because still, although we're not yet no longer in that aftermath of the financial crisis, and there's much more room for social investments, but still there's a lot of room for improvement. That is key. And then one element, because you have to choose. If I would be at national member state level, I would really focus on education and the fact that a lot of children in Europe leave school without any degree or diploma or whatever. And that is one of the reasons that we are not able to, in a structural way, tackle poverty in our society. And so I would really focus on that and make a sort of master plan on these issues. And to be able to do that, you have to connect education with housing. Because children who are living in housing, who are not heated, who do not have enough electricity, who don't have space to study, it's impossible for children to improve themselves in that area. So if I can choose two, it would be that. But from a European perspective, we need to start thinking in terms of investment when it comes to education and social issues.
Thank you very much. As I listen to your developed ideas and responses to my question, I realise it is indeed a thankless task trying to identify just one or two ideas, as these issues are indeed multidimensional. Everything is very closely related, but I think the ideas on education and investing in improving skills in particular is something that the IMF report picked up on very heavily. And those are very valuable ideas to take going forward. As this is a joint EPRS-IMF event, I put the stress on EPRS and bring my colleague Susanna here into the picture. Based on your work and your contribution to the two studies that fed into the report prepared by the special COVI committee, what would you consider to be the most important recommendation that we can take forward for our children?
Yeah, thank you for this question on the most important recommendation. I would like to focus on gathering relevant data on how COVID pandemic affected children and young people. This is all the more relevant in times of subsequent and overlapping crises that we experience. And I think it's also a challenge, taking into account that oftentimes having reliable statistical figures takes time. Also, quality research takes time. So this is a very, very important point to make. And coming from the EPRS and its ex-post evaluation unit, I find it also a very important remark from the other side, from the side that supports the evidence base of politicians and decision makers.
You took the words right out of my mouth. Evidence-based policy making is indeed very difficult to do if we don't have strong and robust data on which we can base our figures and analysis. So thank you to you all for a very productive, albeit brief, exchange of views. And I'd now like to widen the discussion and invite questions from the floor, both online and in the library here. You're welcome to ask any question you like of the panelists here. And before doing so, please briefly introduce yourself before asking your question. And as ever, try to keep the questions short if possible. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Thanks for the panel. My name is Carl Dullan from the European Ombudsman's Office. It's a question for Jean-Jacques and the IMF. I was very struck by the slide where you looked at the fiscal consolidation post-crisis and the maintenance of spending on pensions versus the very deep cuts, to summarize it crudely, in spending on children and social spending on support for children. Since there's no obvious economic logic there, could you comment perhaps on what is the logic? Is it an institutional legal logic about discretionary spending? Is it a political logic about not aggravating sections of society that are more likely to vote, or a combination of both? Or could you elaborate, please?
Yes, I try to refrain from entering into politics there, so it's not my role. I think the best way to answer your question is the genesis of this study. I started working on it in 2019, so before the pandemics. Of course, the focus has changed dramatically because of the pandemics. But that's a spin-off effect of another report we did, which was inequality across generation. We were struck after the financial crisis to see a widening inequality. Inequality in Europe was broadly flat. But the income of the working age population compared to the elderly deteriorated. We didn't look at the children. And that was a strong warning for us. As economists, you don't see anything wrong with that. Total inequality is okay, but inequality across generations were not going down. And we were seeing this as undermining the social fabric or the social contract of Europe. When during crisis, the elderly are well protected, and there's nothing wrong with that. But the others are not well protected, and there's something wrong with that. And we looked, and there comes the question, and we saw the same results in the, if you want, in the paper we saw in the facts, that again, during the COVID, the poverty of elderly have declined, and we're very happy over it. But the poverty of the others has increased. So we widening the income inequality across generation and broader equality across generation. That has a long ripple effect on social fabric and political fabric. I will stop there. That's not, I'm not a social scientist or a political scientist, but that's a good thing. Now the question is, why do we cut children than pensioners? Well, I guess that's easier to do as a policymaker, and you made the point. That's simple as that. And that's a pity, because when you look at pensions, they account by over 60% on average in the EU of social protection, and children do 2%. We have to think also that there are the two types of generations which are dependent on the working age population. And the social choice has been to protect the elderly from a long time. Again, nothing wrong with that. The problem we're highlighting is that the children are not as well protected as the rest of the society. And that's something we're calling society to reflect on if it's still a social choice we want to make. Sorry.
Thank you very much. Would anyone else like to respond to that question?
My name is Sylvia Limmer. I'm a member of parliament, and I was a coordinator of the special COVID committee. Well, we've heard that school closures, lockdowns, and in general disruption of social life is having a negative impact on children. Is that really, are you really trying to sell that as a new insight? I mean, where were you experts why the harm was done? And then second questions, when we are talking about the lessons learned from the pandemic, I'm always lacking one lesson. That what happens when you force people into a vaccination, which is based on a complete new technique where we not at all have any former experience. So what about the victims of that vaccinations? Why am I bringing this up? Because we will never forget.
Thank you for that question. Who would like to take that?
It's a political question. I don't have to. and of course, it's absolutely a point of view that can be taken, and that is taken by some parts in the European Parliament, which is also parts in society. Yeah? We've seen protests against lockdowns, we've seen protests against vaccination, so but it's not carried by the majority in the parliament because it's not reflected in the resolution. That's how the democracy works. So I have to say that's why I said what I said in this panel. I completely changed my mind about closing schools. Not that in the pandemic I was in favor, but we all shut up and we thought this is what's necessary. I wouldn't do that anymore. So it's also good in political life to see, and studies like this, they prove that closing schools has had a hugely negative impact, especially again the most vulnerable people in the school system, and that will have a long-lasting effect. A longer lasting effect than the effect that it had on elderly, just for the reason that the difference in generation. On lockdowns, I think it's important that we have the lessons learned and that we also had a good look at the socioeconomic impact of these lockdowns, and especially also the fact that they were decided at member state level, while purely from a health point of view, you could better take a regional perspective that crosses also borders. So there's been lessons learned, but I still think personally, and that's also reflected in the report, that that measures to contain the virus were very necessary. And the same goes on vaccination. I know there's a part of society that absolutely do not want vaccination. At a certain moment of time, there was a lot of pressure, but there's never been, Sylvia, there's never been an obligation to vaccinate. Of course, there was the connection between the vaccination and the pass, but there's never been, and I would not be in favor of personally of forcing people to get a vaccination. But as I said, there's a difference in point of view on these issues. There is not a majority point of view in the Parliament.
Thank you very much. Yes, of course.
Thanks a lot for this, and thanks a lot for the question. Starting from what you were saying, I just wanted to mention two things. When it comes to lockdown and school closures, as civil society representative here, I must say that civil society was kind of vocal against certain measures, and not necessarily we were listened. I don't want to blame anyone. I think that all Europe and all world has found itself in a crazy situation that we were not ready to respond. And I think that, as you were saying, it is important to learn now that there are things that should not happen again. We cannot take children out of school or nursery or whatever kind of a reaching environment from them. And when it comes to vaccination, I do not enter in the merit of the COVID vaccine. I'm not a scientist. I'm just a citizen as all over. I just want to mention, though, that there are 49 million children dying every year from preventable causes. And preventable causes include also all those diseases that can be cured through routine vaccination. I just want to mention this.
Oh, thank you very much. That's exactly why we wanted to have a representative of children's rights and issues here on the podium, because it's very important to have that broader context in mind. There was a question here from the gentleman on the front row, and then we can move to the lady behind.
Yes, thank you, Ioannis Zerokristos, former head of Secretariat of the COVI committee, with the chairmanship of Mrs. Kathleen Brempt. We have gone through this issue of children in the 4 pillars. So we have looked at in the health, in the fundamental rights. For the health, we had the mental health, the long COVID, fundamental rights, the rights of movement. We had this economic, the education. And also in the EU of the world, we had the equity of the vaccines of distribution. I wanted to ask the question on data, since we have MFF and we have EPRS. It was, and I think Mrs. Kathleen may confirm, everybody was in agreement about the collection of data, that we are missing data on children. And there were proposals for making research. So evidence-based research, according to you, in which directions should be given, and if it is enough, if we have enough for making policy evidence. So in the 4 strands, please.
So a question on the role of evidence, data and evidence-based policy making.
Yes, more data is always better for us. But the problem we have with data, as you rightly saw, research takes time. Research takes time. I started in 2019. At that time, I barely had the data for the end of the global financial crisis. We're in 2023, I still don't have the data for severe material deprivation in 2021. So it's not just the quantity of the data, it's the lag. And to be honest with you, and it's good for that, we have to run several times the regressions on the same period just because data were massively revised. And you can draw the wrong conclusion if the data are not solid. So yes, we need more data, but we need also timely data on children. And it's a long, as I say, it's a multidimensional factor. We chose, for various reasons that are explained in the paper, to focus on severe material deprivation. But as I say, it's a multidimensional factor. We have to look at different dimensions, and we will not do it just because we don't want to speculate. We just want to look at the data and draw from them the most information that we can.
Thank you, and I'd just like to move quickly to one last question there.
Thank you. It's very interesting, this COVID time. My name is Stella Veliki. I have studied physics and informatics. I'm a member of the European Physics Society. Concerning the vaccination, I don't agree with Frau Lima. I am very clearly for the vaccination. It was no obligation. You receive only a paper. You are free to go or not. Nobody come to look after you. You have no impeachment, nothing. It's not an obligation. I know that AfD is a far-right political party in Germany. They do a lot of strike in Germany against this vaccination. But this vaccination, COVID vaccination, save a lot of lives. And this is very important. Sure, you have some problem, you have some. So my question is not only to say that. My question is for the children. I very agree with the political of the European Parliament to inform the children, the young people. The young children, they understand all if you explain them, and they are very open to do it. My question is, I speak a lot of children in the school, in students and the university during the COVID time. They have a lot of lack of knowledges. They didn't pass the exam. They didn't pass the class. And I ask them, what do you think we must do? You must make a 6 or 3 months very intensive recuperation lessons in the school and in the university, that they bring them without test, without nothing, to bring them to the level. And my question is, if it's not possible to put this in case of this situation of crisis, put this in your policy.
Thank you. I think that's a very valid point. If my memory serves me correctly, the Parliament's resolution did indeed call for something along those lines for summer schools to be organised for children to help them catch up. But perhaps I'll let Kathleen van Brempt take that.
Very briefly, absolutely. And again, I would recommend to make a combination between what you've said and looking really where the gaps are because of closures of schools, but it's more than closure of schools. I'm the mom of a 16-year-old. She was 14 at that time. The worst possible things happened not during in the schools, not during the school closure, but when at the end of the pandemic, well, we're still in the, depends on how you look at it, but when the school started again, and there was no school closure, but then teachers were at the end of their ability. So they either had COVID or they had a burnout, and the others had to solve the problem. I don't know whether it was the same in other member states, but it was like there was a huge chaos. So it's not just the school closure, right? It's the overall effect. But I would make a combination with that and the overall problem of the vulnerable children in schools also today, regardless of the pandemic, and the fact that so many youngsters leave school without any education or any degree. And for that, you need more than summer schools. You need a sort of master plan. And I think it should be one of the focal points for the next European term when it comes to child poverty.
Thank you very much. Would you like to say something very briefly?
And we need to listen to children.
Yes.
We need to listen to them. We need to hear from them what they need. And we need to adapt our policies to their needs.
If I could ask a final question, what are your thoughts as to how can we increase the voice of children?
Well, we have now the child participation platform that's for consulting with children. We need to ensure that children hear us, listen to us, and participate in the policy making. Lowering the voting age to 16 for the European elections, a great step. Let's try to expand it to all EU member states. And when we do campaigning, which is for Save the Children or for the European Parliament elections, we need to engage directly with them. And they need to know that we are responding to their needs. We cannot continue to have this top-down approach, pretending to know what children and especially young people want.
Thank you very much. And I think that's a very positive note to end on this afternoon. So it brings us to the end of our proceedings today. I think we've all learned a great deal. I know that I certainly have, listening to your fascinating presentations. You've put forward a very wide range of diverging views. Each one's valid and important. You've all brought a unique perspective here to the discussions. And if we can all agree on one thing, it's probably that we have certainly a lot of work to do ahead if we're to secure a brighter future for our children and ensure we never again repeat the mistakes of the pandemic. So I'd like to once again extend a very warm thank you to our guests from the IMF. You've provided us with some very solid data for the basis of our discussions. Thank you to Margherita Leone. Your organization's perspective has really brought some great added value to the discussions today. And last but not least, Madame van Brempt, your presence here has shown, demonstrated your willingness to listen to the views of experts and to take them on board. And thank you, of course, Susanna, for being here with me, supporting the EPRS as always. And one last thought, perhaps, is precisely by working together like this and sharing ideas that we can truly make progress and learn from one another. So thank you.